And today we are discussing Heracleon, who is another Valentinian. And let's get right into it.
Yep, welcome everyone. This is chapter 16 in the book Found Christianities. Heracleon is a really important thinker, and unlike Marcus, we know that Heracleon is a direct disciple of Valentinus, and his main claim to fame is he is the very first commentator on the Gospel of John. So, whereas today, you think like, wow, there's so many commentaries on John. It's Heracleon who started this whole process. But let's talk about him in terms of when he lived. So Heracleon flourishes, we think, between 160 and 180. He's probably in Rome, and he is, by about 200, called the most esteemed of Valentinus's disciples. So he is sort of the head honcho by the time you get to the late 2nd century. He is the first, as I said, known person to write a commentary on the Gospel of John. Okay, so this is really important, and it shows you, again, as we saw with Marcus, as we saw with Ptolemy, that these Christians are reading their Bibles, okay? And not only reading, actually, they are the first intellectuals to engage with a scriptural text on an academic level and actually give you the full rundown of, the actual literary analysis. Okay, so this is huge. Heracleon takes almost everything in John as an allegory, and which means that he viewed everything pretty much as symbolic, though he didn't deny the historicity of the events and characters in the gospel. Okay, this is really important because some might give you the impression that mythicism was prevalent in the ancient world, and that's just not true. In fact, there's not any early Christian who's a mythicist. But what they are, they don't deny that Jesus existed. They all assume that, but they take the acts and sayings of Jesus in a symbolic way as a message of higher truth. And that's definitely the case with Heracleon. So there's different levels of scripture. Turns out that Heracleon only survives through quotation, but the good part is that there's a lot of quotations of Heracleon. So Origen, if any of you know Origen of Alexandria, he quotes nearly 50 fragments of Heracleon's commentary on John. And you can get a translation of this online, I think. And if you just punch it into Google, and hopefully at some point I'll make my own translation available on the Patreon here. Clement also quotes 2 other really nice fragments, apparently from a commentary on Luke. So Heracleon not only tackles John, he seems to tackle Luke as well, which is amazing. I mean, that's amazingly productive work. And yeah, we really wish we had the whole thing, but we've got about, I would say, maybe when you combine everything, it's at least about 10 pages of text.
Wow. That's a lot.
So when you, we talked about the Valentinian notion of the creator, and Heracleon, we talked about this with Ptolemy, and Heracleon makes clear something that Ptolemy didn't make clear. Since Heracleon is a reader of John, he really emphasizes that the logos, sometimes translated word, creates the world through the creator. Okay, so the word is the creator because it says in John, all things were made through him. Okay, but the actual person doing the labor is the creator. Okay, the creator is an intermediate being. Okay, so he's not the true God. He is a being who's on his own intellectual and moral journey, and he himself needs salvation. The true God is a being Heracleon calls the Father of Truth. And this is also, we see that word for the true God, that phrase used also in the Gospel of Truth. So that's an interesting connection there as well. But there's no hostility to the Creator, even though he's not the true God. That's something different than Marcion and the Sethians. One of the most interesting aspects about Heracleon, and there's lots and lots of stuff that's interesting, but one of the things that catches the interest of many people is that he believes that there are basically three groups of people, and he groups them by their response to Jesus, basically their response to the Savior. Some people, he says, just simply reject Jesus and the Christian message without understanding it. Okay, they just can't deal with religion and they don't want to hear about it, and there you go. Those are people whom Heracleon called material. Then there's a camp that has acceptance, jumping down to the bottom here, that has acceptance with recognition. And in fact, it's immediate recognition. So they hear the message of Jesus and it's like an epiphany. It just hits them like a load of bricks and it's like, wow. And they see the truth of it and it's like light shining on their eyes and they accept it joyfully. These are the spiritual people. But most people, I guess you might call them the agnostics here. Most people are those who hesitate and waver, okay? And they are the animates. All right, and the animates can go in one or two directions. Ultimately, they can, after some hesitation, simply reject Jesus, and then they become material, or they can grow and intellectually mature and become spiritual, okay? And those are the three paths. And they're not, it's often said by heresiologists that these three types of people are absolutely set in stone and determined. And that's not true. Heracleon really shows that you can change from one state to the other. Heracleon doesn't believe in hell. So the worst punishment that a material person can get is simply to not exist. And they don't exist. Animate people are saved, but they're saved at a lower level. Spiritual people enter the fullness. And for the fullness, you can check out the episode on the Gospel of Truth and on Marcus, the Valentinian. So those are the three paths, okay? Now, just to give you an example of the way that Heracleon allegorized the Gospel of John, he looked at the passage where Jesus is in the temple and, it's built in 46 years. And just like Marcus, Heracleon thinks about this number 46. And he's like, what does the 46 mean? Well, 40 means something and 6 means something. And he gives you his interpretation, okay? But something also he says is there are, the temple has or represents the three states, and outside the temple, that is outside the walls, are the material people. In the outer court are the animates, the animate people, and in the Holy of Holies are the spiritual people. And when Jesus goes, if you read early in John, Jesus goes into the temple and makes a whip of cords and drives out the money changers with selling animals and doves. And Heracleon takes this as Jesus driving out the material people from the temple, because salvation is not about anything regarding matter, okay? Heracleon definitely would not be interested in the salvation of matter. Matter simply perishes and burns up at the end of time. And Jesus's mission really is cast out the material people, but help the animate people transition to the spiritual level, to increase in, we might say, holiness, but in more sort of common sense language, increase their moral and intellectual stature so that they can enter into the upper realms. Okay.
So he thinks that the temple is a depiction of the three different types of people, being the
Exactly.
inner holy of holies is where all the spiritual saved people of salvation with people with gnosis are at.
Exactly. So that another way of saying it is that the Holy of Holies, it represents the realm of the fullness, and that's where you eternally abide with your angel. The animate people, their salvation is lesser, so they're in the forecourt, which represents the eighth realm or the Ogdoad. And the material people are, they never leave this world. And at the end of time, when this world simply burns up in a bonfire, they just cease to exist.
Wow.
Um, so that's that's what he sees in the temple. Now, it's a great example where Heracleon, if he were here and you asked him, well, do you believe that there was actually a physical, literal temple in back in Jesus's day? He would say, well, of course. But the point of the gospel is not to stay on that sort of rudimentary, what you might call historical level, but to rise up to the actual Christian message, the actual spiritual message, which is about, for him, your response to Jesus and your eternal destiny. So that's
Interesting.
what he brings out. Now, there's tons and tons more about Heracleon, and he goes through line by line reading the Gospel of John. So if you love that gospel, and if you want a totally different take on it, which is really complex and fun, go read those fragments. But for now, I just will say thank you so much to all of you for your support. It's really, really golden. And feel free to leave comments and yeah, make your thoughts known. And yeah, I'll just basically turn it back over to you, Neil, if you want to throw in any final remarks or questions, and we'll go from there.
Well, the one thing and now I'm wondering after this one and the last one we just had is that it seems like these Gnostics that we call them Gnostics, but whatever they call themselves, Valentinians or just Christians of different belief system, they really seem to like John. Is there a reason why they like John more than the other Gospels, or is that just maybe I'm just looking at this in my own way?
Well, it's often said that they like John, and that's certainly the case. I mean, Heracleon will ever go down in history as the first commentator on the Gospel of John. That is his absolute claim to fame. He's absolutely first. And so, all of these Orthodox lovers of John have to deal with that fact that the first known commentator on John is somebody that they would call a heretic. And so, but that's not what we call him. We call him a Christian because that's what he called himself. So, but the basic thing is, if you were to look at the Valentinian usage, though, of the Gospels, it's actually Matthew is pound for pound just as common as John is.
Sure.
And for instance, if you look in the Gospel of Truth and you try to find out what all the gospel quotations are, you'll find there that there's a lot from Matthew and a lot from John, and both of those seem to be favored. And to the question, are these other Christians using John more than, say, incipient Catholics? It doesn't actually seem that they're using it more. You might be able to make the argument that they're using it in a more sophisticated, symbolic way that's in accord with their higher education, but they're not actually using it more, and so that's something to keep in mind.
It's just kind of fascinating to see that the first person to put together a coherent New Testament, Marcion, first person to put together a coherent uh, commentary on John, is a heretic. It's like where makes you wonder all these early Christians that are now deemed as heretics, they were the ones that were actually moving the needle forward, and almost makes you wonder if Christianity would even be what it became without the heretics. Sort of like they built up this foundation, and then after that foundation was built, the Christians used that foundation to stand on to call the people who built the foundation heretics. I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Neil. the truth of the matter is, yeah, these are just highly intellectual and really smart Christians. And that shows you why these anachronistic labels of orthodoxy and heresy really just play into the apologist's hands. That these are creative innovators and entrepreneurs. That's who they are. That's who they view themselves. They are successful in their own time. They are really, really smart, path breakers, inventive, fun to read, and doing the real creative work in Christianity. That's not to say that they're the only people doing creative work, but they and their impact continues today, because let's face it, I mean, Christians are still writing commentaries on John. You know, it's like a cottage industry. They just don't stop, you know, and you wish, pray to God that they don't. But Heracleon was the first, and so there, in a sense, all these so-called Orthodox commentators on John are just following in the footsteps of a heretic. Now, I say that in a deliberately anachronistic way, but the point is that yeah, he is the innovator, and
Yeah.
he's the path breaker. So that's why he's the most esteemed.
And you have all just attained true gnosis.